Let's get started. Story number 1.
I grew up in a small town in Kentucky where everyone knew each other's business. The kind of town where you could leave your front door unlocked and it still felt safe. But that was before I lived in the old farmhouse on the edge of town, before everything changed. We moved into the house in the fall of 1998. It was a 3-story home with creaky floors and tall windows that let in a lot of light during the day, but were almost too dark at night. My parents were eager to settle down and start a new chapter in their lives, so when they found the house, they didn't hesitate to buy it. The realtor mentioned that it was an old farmhouse, but he didn't go into much detail about its history. He made a passing comment about it being a bit quiet on the property, which we thought was a charming description. It wasn't long after we settled in that I began to feel uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. The house was beautiful in an old-fashioned way with wooden floors, a stone fireplace in the living room, and a staircase that creaked under the smallest step. My parents were busy with work, and my older sister, Kate, was away at college, so I spent most of my time in the house alone after school. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. The house was freezing at night, no matter how high we turned up the thermostat. I remember sitting in the living room wrapped in a blanket, my teeth chattering even though the heat was blasting. It wasn't just the cold that made me feel uncomfortable. It was the stillness, the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I was a teenager, and I often got spooked when I was alone. But it wasn't long before I started hearing things. The first time I heard it, I was in the kitchen, preparing a snack. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the wooden floor above me. I froze, my heart racing. I was home alone, and my parents wouldn't be back for hours. I called out, but there was no answer. The footsteps continued for a few moments, then abruptly stopped. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and cautiously made my way upstairs, but there was no one there. The second time it happened, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the floor outside my room. The steps were heavy, slow, and they seemed to stop just outside my door. I sat up in bed, terrified. My mind raced. Could it be my parents home early? But no, my parents hadn't even called to say they were on their way. I waited. The footsteps lingered for what felt like an eternity before they began again, moving down the hallway and then downstairs. I didn't dare leave my room. I stayed under the covers, my heart thumping in my chest. When my parents finally came home that night, I told them about the noises, but they brushed it off. My dad insisted that it was just the house settling. But things didn't settle. They escalated. Over the following weeks, I began to notice that the lights would flicker for no reason. The temperature would drop suddenly, even in rooms that were heated. My mother would sometimes complain about hearing voices at night, whispers, just barely audible, coming from the direction of the staircase. She said it felt like someone was watching her. One evening, things took a more disturbing turn. I was sitting in the living room when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the hallway. It was tall, too tall for any human figure, with broad shoulders and long, gaunt limbs. The thing was so dark that it seemed to absorb the light around it, as though it were made from shadows themselves. It didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I couldn't look away, but I couldn't move either. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure faded into the shadows as if it were never there. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing, and ran upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I heard the whispers again, louder this time. The voices were unintelligible at first, but as I strained to listen, I could make out a word here and there. Leave. Help. Not safe. The next day, I researched the history of the house. I couldn't find anything about it in the town's records, but the older locals had stories. One of them told me the house had been built in the early 1900s by a man named Charles Murphy, who had lived there with his wife and child. Charles had been a recluse, and rumors spread that he was involved in strange occult practices. According to some accounts, he had even been seen wandering the property late at night, speaking to himself in a language no one could understand. But the most chilling part of the story was what happened to his family. His wife and child had disappeared one night, vanishing without a trace. Some said they left him. Others said they had died under mysterious circumstances, but no one knew for sure. Charles was found dead in the house several years later, but the cause of death was never determined. Some believed he had committed suicide, others that he had simply succumbed to madness. After his death, the house had been abandoned for many years. It was then that I understood. The house had always been haunted, not just by the memory of its original owner, but by something darker. Charles hadn't been the only one to suffer in that house. It was as if the house itself had absorbed all of the pain, the loss, and the madness that had occurred within its walls. And now, whatever had been left behind was still there, waiting for someone else to feel its presence. I didn't stay much longer after that. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure in the hallway, they all became too much. The house had a way of draining you, wearing you down until you couldn't tell where the house ended and you began. It was suffocating, and it didn't want us there. The last night I spent there, I saw the figure again. It was in the living room, standing at the top of the staircase, its shadow stretching across the floor. This time, though, it didn't fade away. It moved toward me, slowly, deliberately. I ran. I didn't even stop to pack my things. I left the house that night and never looked back. It's been years since I've stepped foot in that farmhouse, but sometimes I still hear the whispers. I can't help but wonder if the house is still waiting, if the darkness that lurked in the corners of that place is still there, lingering, waiting for the next person to come along and discover its secrets.
Story number 2.
I never used to believe in ghosts. I was one of those people who would scoff at haunted house stories, roll my eyes at friends who swore they saw something in the dark. Then, in 2015, something happened to me that I still struggle to explain. It started when I moved into a small rental house just outside of Richmond, Virginia. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, and the house was a perfect place to start over. Cheap rent, quiet neighborhood, nothing too fancy, but enough space for me to feel comfortable. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was old, built in the 1940s, so it had its quirks. Floorboards that creaked even when no one was walking on them, pipes that groaned when the water was running. I told myself it was just settling noises, things you hear when a house has history. Then came the smell. It started as something faint, just a whiff of something rotting that would come and go. At first I thought maybe a mouse had died in the walls, but no matter how much I cleaned or sprayed air freshener, the smell always came back. Worse, it seemed strongest in my bedroom, right near my bed. One night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I felt it, a pressure, as if someone had just sat down on the edge of my mattress. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the weight shifting the mattress. I bolted upright and turned on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. The smell was stronger than ever. After that, things escalated. I started waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of knocking, always 3 knocks, always coming from inside the walls. My closet door, which I always shut before bed, would be open in the morning. Once I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open, even though I had locked it before falling asleep. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." I shot up in bed, heart hammering. The voice was coming from inside my room. I turned on every light I could, shaking, but there was no one there. I started sleeping with the TV on, the volume turned up just enough to drown out any nighttime noises. It helped a little, but I still felt watched, like something was just waiting for me to let my guard down. One evening, a friend of mine, Jake, came over. I hadn't told him about the weird things happening. I didn't want to sound crazy, but as we were sitting in the living room, he suddenly stiffened. "Dude," he said, his voice low, "did you see that?" "See what?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The hallway. I just saw someone walk past the doorway." A chill ran through me. We were the only ones in the house. Jake got up and checked the hallway, then my bedroom, then the bathroom. Nothing. But I could see it in his face. He wasn't messing with me. That night, I decided I had to know what I was dealing with. I started researching the history of the house. What I found made me sick. In the late 1970s, a man named Charles Whitmore had lived there. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, but his neighbors noticed that he never seemed to leave the house. One day, the mail started piling up outside. After a few weeks, someone called the police. They found Charles's body in the bedroom. He had been dead for over a month. The official cause was ruled as suicide, but there were rumors, stories about how the body had been found sitting upright on the bed, as if someone had posed it. The worst part? His neighbors swore they had seen him looking out of the bedroom window days after he was supposed to be dead. After I read that, everything made sense. The feeling of being watched, the weight on my bed, the knocking, the whispers. That night was the worst of all. I was asleep, or at least trying to be, when something touched me. Not a light brush, not the feeling of pressure. Something grabbed my ankle. I yanked my foot back and scrambled for the lamp. But before I could turn it on, the whisper came again, closer than ever, right next to my ear. "Let me in." I screamed and bolted out of bed. I didn't care about my things. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house barefoot, not stopping until I was inside my car. I drove to a motel that night and called my landlord the next morning. I told him I was breaking the lease. He didn't argue. He just sighed and said, "You're not the first." I moved out that same day. I don't know what was in that house. Maybe it was Charles. Maybe it was something else, something older, something that had been there long before he ever lived there. But I do know one thing. I still have nightmares about that whisper. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I swear I can still smell that awful, rotting stench. Story the end.
Story number 3.
When I was 23, I took a job as a night security guard for an old office building in downtown Chicago. It wasn't a glamorous job, but the pay was decent, and I liked the solitude. The building had once been a hotel in the early 1900s before being converted into office spaces. The floors above the 6th level were mostly vacant, and my main job was to patrol the empty hallways, check the security cameras, and make sure no one was trespassing. At first, it was easy work. The building was always silent at night, aside from the occasional sound of pipes groaning or the wind rattling the old windows. I spent most of my shift walking the floors, making rounds, and killing time on my phone in the security office. But then, strange things started happening. One night, around 2 a.m., I was doing my usual patrol when I heard something. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps coming from above me. The problem? I was on the top floor. Nobody was supposed to be up there. I radioed the front desk asking if anyone had come in. The receptionist, an older guy named Mike, checked the visitor logs. "Nobody's been in or out since 10 p.m., he said. I hesitated, then took the elevator up to the 7th floor, one of the abandoned levels. The second the doors opened, I felt it. The air was heavy, like I had just walked into a room filled with fog, except the air was clear. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with empty offices. The lights flickered, then I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the far end of the hall. I swallowed hard and gripped my flashlight, forcing myself to move toward the sound. "Security," I called out. "Anyone here?" Silence. I walked past one of the old offices and glanced inside. The door had a small window, and through it I could see the faint outline of a desk, an old chair, and a shadow. It was standing near the far wall, motionless. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my flashlight toward it, but the second the beam hit the window, the shadow was gone. I backed away and hurried toward the elevator. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, my heart hammering. After that night, things got worse. The security cameras started picking up strange distortions. At first, it was just static, occasional interference in the feeds. But then, one night, I saw something that made my stomach drop. I was scanning the monitors when I saw movement on one of the screens. The 7th floor, the same hallway where I had seen the shadow. There was a figure standing in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't clear, more like a dark, smudged silhouette against the grainy footage. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, willing it to move, to prove to me that it was just a trick of the camera. Then, without warning, the screen cut to static. When the feed came back, the hallway was empty. I told Mike about it the next day. He sighed and rubbed his temples. I was hoping you wouldn't start seeing things, he muttered. What do you mean? I asked. He leaned back in his chair. Every guard that works here eventually sees something. Some quit right away. Some last a few months before they can't take it anymore. I asked him if he had ever seen anything himself. He nodded. I've been here 15 years. The first time I saw it was back in 2008. A woman standing at the end of the hall on the 7th floor. No face, just a shadow. I blinked, and she was gone. A chill ran through me. You ever find out who she is? Mike hesitated, then sighed. There was a fire here, back when it was still a hotel in 1912. The 7th floor took the worst of it. At least 12 people died. Some of their bodies were never recovered. After that, I stopped going to the 7th floor unless I absolutely had to. But the activity didn't stop. One night I was in the elevator heading up to check. I pressed the button for the 6th floor, but instead of stopping, the elevator kept rising. The doors open on the 7th floor. The hallway was dark. The lights, which should have been on, were completely off. The air was freezing. I stepped forward, my breath coming out in visible puffs. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost like a breath against my ear. Help me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the cold night air. That was my last shift. I quit the next day. I don't know what I saw in that building. I don't know if it was the spirits of the people who died in the fire or something else, something older. But I do know one thing. Whatever it was, it wanted to be seen. And it wasn't going to stop.
Story number 4.
I was 16 when my family moved into that house. It was an old Victorian, the kind with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and a sense of history that clung to the walls. My parents were thrilled. A big house in a quiet town, a fresh start. I wasn't so sure. Something about it felt wrong. The first time I felt it was our first night there. I was in my room unpacking boxes when I heard a whisper. Soft, barely audible, but clear. Come here. I froze. I turned toward the door. The hall was empty. My parents were downstairs, still organizing. My little sister, Lily, was in her room across the hall, humming to herself. I told myself I imagined it. A week later, Lily told me something strange. There's a girl in my room, she said. I frowned. What do you mean? Lily was only 8. She had a wild imagination, always talking about fairies and ghosts. But something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. She watches me, she said. At night. I forced a smile. Just a dream, Lil. She didn't argue. She just looked toward her closet. That night, I stayed up late reading. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Light, slow, almost hesitant. I thought it was Lily going to our parents' room, but the footsteps stopped right outside my door. Then the doorknob turned. I sat up, my pulse pounding. The door didn't open, but I saw the knob twist just slightly, like someone was testing it. I stood up and yanked it open. The hallway was empty. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. A cold draft moved past me, brushing against my skin. My breath caught in my throat. I checked Lily's room. She was asleep, curled up under her blankets. I told myself it was my imagination. 2 weeks later, Lily stopped sleeping in her room. She refused. My parents tried everything, but she would wake up screaming, saying the girl was standing over her bed. One night, I offered to stay with her. I wasn't going to let my little sister be afraid in her own home. I set up a sleeping bag on the floor. Lily finally drifted off, but I stayed awake. At around 2 a.m., I heard it. A slow creak. I turned my head. The closet door was opening. Not fast, not sudden. Just inching open as if something was inside, pushing it. My throat tightened. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The closet was empty. But the air inside, it felt thick, almost like stepping into deep water. Then I smelled it. A faint, rotting scent. I didn't sleep. The next morning I told my mom. She dismissed it. Old houses make noises, she said. That night I had a dream. I was standing in the hallway and the house was dark, too dark. I could barely breathe. Then I saw her. A girl standing at the end of the hall, long black hair, a white nightgown stained at the hem, her head tilted to the side and her eyes, they were wrong. Hollow. Empty. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I woke up gasping, and I wasn't alone. The closet door was open again, and I swear, just for a second, I saw a shadow standing inside. The next day I did some research on the house. I didn't expect to find much, but I did. In 1947, a girl named Eleanor had lived there. She was 11 when she died. They found her body in the closet. Cause of death? Unknown. I didn't tell Lily. I didn't want her to be more afraid. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I don't know why I thought that would help. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft, scratching sound. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was coming from my closet. Scrape, 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 slow, rhythmic. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then the whisper came, so close it was almost inside my ear. Come here. The door rattled. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Then just as suddenly, it stopped. I moved out as soon as I turned 18. My parents and Lily stayed for another year before selling the house. I never went back. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I still hear that whisper, and I wonder if she ever found someone else to come to her. Story the end.